Ever wondered how bad punishment could get? How far would medieval authorities go to enforce the law? The Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their gentle approach to justice. In fact, the period between the 5th and 15th centuries saw some of the most horrific punishments ever devised by humanity. Number 7. The breaking wheel. Could you imagine being tied to a giant wooden wheel? That's exactly what happened to countless unfortunates during the Middle Ages. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was one of the most feared execution methods of medieval times. The condemned would be tied spread-eagled to a large wooden wheel. Then the executioner would use an iron hammer to smash the victim's limbs between the gaps in the wheel. The goal wasn't a quick death. Quite the opposite. Executioners aimed to break every major bone in the body without killing the victim. After the breaking, the shattered body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel was then mounted on a pole and displayed publicly. Victims might remain alive for days in excruciating pain. Exposed to the elements and birds of prey, deaths were agonizingly slow, coming from dehydration, shock, or blood loss. This punishment was reserved for the worst criminals, murderers, and thieves. The practice was especially common in France and Germany. In some cases, as act of mercy, executioners might deliver a coup de grace, a killing blow to the chest or stomach, to end suffering more quickly. One famous victim was Peter Stump, known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, who was executed in 1589. He allegedly confessed, likely under torture, to practicing black magic and killing and eating 14 children and 2 pregnant women. His punishment on the breaking wheel was particularly severe, even by medieval standards. Number 6. Trial by ordeal. What if your guilt or innocence was determined by whether you floated in water, or how fast your burns healed? Trial by ordeal was a bizarre judicial practice based on the belief that God would protect the innocent from harm during dangerous tests. This wasn't just some rare practice. It was an official legal procedure throughout much of Europe. The most common ordeals involved fire and water. In the ordeal by fire, the accused would have to carry a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance or walk barefoot across hot plowshares. If their burns healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If the wounds festered, they were guilty. In the ordeal by water, things got even stranger. The accused would be bound and tossed into a body of water. The logic: water, being pure, would reject the guilty. So if you floated, you were deemed guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, though you might drown in the process if no one pulled you out quickly enough. There was also the ordeal of the bitter water, where the accused drank a mixture of holy water and dirt from the church floor. If they got sick, they were guilty. If not, they were innocent. The Fourth Lateran Council finally banned clergy participation in trials by ordeal in 1215, which effectively ended the practice. Still, it persisted in some areas well into the 14th century. A fascinating tidbit. Some historians believe those administering these trials weren't as impartial as they claimed. There's evidence suggesting that priests and officials could manipulate outcomes, essentially deciding innocence or guilt themselves, while maintaining the appearance of divine judgment. Number 5. The Pear of Anguish. Have you ever seen a metal device shaped like a pear? The Pear of Anguish ranks among the most disturbing torture instruments ever created. This pear-shaped metal device was inserted into various orifices of the victim's body, the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on their crime. Once inserted, a key or screw mechanism would be turned. causing the pear to slowly expand. The device had several small spikes or sharp edges that would further damage the victim as it opened. This torture didn't typically kill the victim outright, but the internal damage and bleeding it caused could certainly lead to death. The Pear of Anguish was often used against women accused of witchcraft, homosexual men, and those deemed guilty of blasphemy or heresy. For blasphemers, it was inserted into the mouth, literally silencing them while causing extreme pain. What makes this device particularly disturbing is the psychological aspect. Victims knew what was about to happen, creating terror even before the actual torture began. Additionally, while some medieval tortures were public, this one was typically performed in private chambers, adding to the victim's isolation and helplessness. Some historians debate how widely used the Pear of Anguish actually was, with some suggesting it might be a later invention attributed to medieval times. However, various museums across Europe display versions of this device, testifying to its existence even if the scale of its use remains unclear. Number 4. Scold's bridle. What if you talked too much in medieval times? The consequences could be shockingly severe, especially for women. The Scold's bridle, also known as the branks, was a metal cage placed over a woman's head with a piece of iron that extended into her mouth to prevent speech. This device wasn't used for those who committed serious crimes like murder or theft. Instead, it targeted women considered gossips, scolds, or generally too outspoken for medieval society's taste. The punishment essentially turned women into public spectacles, humiliating them while causing significant physical pain. The bridle's metal bit often had spikes that pressed against or pierced the tongue. Any attempt to speak would result in severe lacerations. Some versions included bells to draw further attention to the woman as she was paraded through town. Husbands could request this punishment for their wives, and local magistrates frequently obliged. The woman would typically wear the bridle for several hours or even days, while being led through public spaces for maximum humiliation. What's particularly disturbing about the Scold's bridle is how it reveals medieval attitudes toward women's speech. A woman who spoke too freely was considered dangerous enough to warrant this painful public punishment. Some bridles even featured decorative elements, like donkey ears, to further mock the wearer. The practice began around the 16th century, and shockingly, continued in some areas until the early 19th century. The last recorded use in Britain was reportedly in 1856 in Bolton, Lancashire. Number 3. Rat torture. Would you believe that rats were used as torture devices? In one of the most nightmarish medieval punishments, hungry rats became weapons against human flesh. This method was relatively inexpensive, but horrifically effective. The basic procedure involved placing a rat on the victim's body, usually the stomach, and covering it with a metal container or bucket. The container would then be slowly heated. As the metal became hot, the rat would become desperate to escape and would begin to burrow into the victim's body, the only direction it could go. The victim would remain fully conscious during this process, feeling the rat clawing and gnawing through their flesh. Death, when it finally came, was due to blood, loss, shock, or infection, none of which were quick. This torture method wasn't only physically devastating but psychologically traumatizing. Victims would feel and hear the rat's desperate movements as it tried to escape the heat. Some accounts suggest executioners would sometimes place the rats near the face, where they might burrow through a cheek or into an eye socket. While rat torture was used throughout medieval Europe, it became particularly associated with the Tower of London and Dutch prisons. It's worth noting that some historians debate how widespread this practice actually was, suggesting it might have been more limited than popular culture implies. Nevertheless, contemporary accounts confirm its existence. A variation of this torture involved securing rats to the victim's body using a cage-like device rather than using heat to drive the rats to burrow. Either way, the fundamental horror remained the same, using a living creature's survival instinct as a weapon against human flesh. Number 2. Sawing. How about being cut in half, starting between the legs? Medieval executioners sometimes employed a method so gruesome, it's hard to believe it was real. Death by sawing. This execution method involved hanging the condemned person upside down from a tree or scaffold and then sawing through their body, beginning at the groin. The upside-down positioning was deliberate and diabolical. It ensured blood would remain in the brain, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Victims would remain alive until the saw reached their chest or neck, experiencing unimaginable pain throughout. Historical records show this practice was used across various parts of Europe, with documented cases in France, Italy, and parts of Germanic regions. It was typically reserved for the most severe crimes, including heresy, witchcraft, murder, and treason. In some variations, the sawing was done between two boards that sandwiched the victim. In others, two executioners would work a large two-handled saw. The process could take significant time, prolonging the victim's suffering. One of the most famous depictions of this punishment comes from The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, painted around 1500, showing this torture as one of many hellish punishments. A particularly dark aspect of sawing executions was their public nature. Like many medieval punishments, they served as warnings to others and macabre entertainment. Crowds would gather to watch, sometimes bringing children to witness the consequences of crime. Number 1. Boiling alive. Can you imagine being lowered slowly into a cauldron of boiling water or oil? In what might be the most horrific punishment on our list, medieval authorities sometimes sentenced criminals to be boiled alive. This execution method was particularly common for poisoners, counterfeiters, and those who committed crimes against a sovereign. In England, it was officially sanctioned as a punishment for poisoning under the 1531 Act for Poisoning during Henry VIII's reign. The condemned would typically be suspended above a cauldron of boiling liquid, usually water, oil, tar, or even lead. They might be lowered in all at once for a quicker, though still agonizing, death, or inch by inch to maximize suffering. In some cases, the victim was placed in cold water that was then gradually heated, prolonging the torture. One well-documented case is that of Richard Rosso, a cook in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. In 1531, he was accused of poisoning a meal that killed 2 people. As punishment, he was boiled alive at Smithfield in London. According to chroniclers, it was a slow death designed to maximize pain. What made this punishment particularly terrifying was not just the excruciating pain, but also the very public nature of the execution. The sight and sounds of a human being boiled alive, the screams, the smell, the visible deterioration of the body, served as a powerful deterrent. The practice began to decline in the late 16th century as more humane execution methods like hanging gained favor. However, isolated cases occurred well into the 17th century in various parts of Europe. Were these punishments simply the product of a barbaric age? Or do they reveal something deeper about human nature and the extremes societies will go to when enforcing order? As we look back at these medieval horrors from our modern perspective, we might wonder, have we truly progressed as much as we'd like to believe? Or have our cruelties simply taken new forms,